Pulp cavities of the maxillary teeth. Let's have a discussion on the maxillary central incisor. In the maxillary central incisor labiolingual section, you can see this in figure 13.8a. See figure 13.8 showing the maxillary central incisor sections of natural specimen. The pictures in picture A1 through 6 showing the labiolingual section, right? This aspect does not appear in radiographs. Which one? The labiolingual aspect this aspect does not appear in radiographs. Let's have a discussion on the labiolingual section. The pulp cavity follows the general outline of the crown and root. The pulp chamber is very narrow in the incisal region. If a great amount of secondary or irritation induced dentin, secondary dentin, which is a physiologic process, it forms throughout the life. Irritation induced dentin is forms when there is any traumatic injury to the pulp, right? If a great amount of secondary or irritation induced dentin has been produced, this portion of the pulp chamber, that is at the incisal region, may be partially or completely obliterated. You can see this in figure 13.8a3. see here figure 13.a3, you can see the pulp chamber at the incisal region is almost obliterated because of the formation of secondary dentin or the irritation induced dentin. In the cervical region of the tooth, the pulp chamber increases to its largest labiolingual dimension, right? Below the cervical area, the root canal tapers, gradually ending in an constriction at the apex of the tooth called the apical constriction. The apical foramen is usually located near the very tip of the root. The apical foramen is usually located near the very tip of the root, but may be located slightly to the labial. You can see this in figure 13.8 A3, 4, 5. This is the A picture. You can see this in figure 13.A3, 4, 5. You can see this apical constriction. Apical constriction is present slightly labial, not at the apex, right? In 3, 4, 5, slightly labial, not at the tip of the root. In 3, 4 and 5. Or lingual aspect of the root. You can see this in figure 13.8a1 and 6, right? This apical foramen is present lingual in 1 and 6, not presenting at the apex, not presenting at the tip of the root. Because of this generalized phenomenon, it has been suggested that the root canal filling should appear on the radiographs to extend no closer than 1 mm from the radiographic apex of the tooth. Because of this generalized phenomenon, it has been suggested that the root canal filling should appear on radiographs to extend no closer than 1 mm from the radiographic apex of the tooth. However, with the use of an electronic apical locator, the clinician can have more confidence in more closely reaching the apex without overfilling. Mesodistal section. You can see this in figure 13.8b. The pulp chamber is wider. The pulp chamber is wider in the mesodistal dimension than in the labiolingual dimension, right? The pulp cavity conforms to the general shape of the outer surface of the tooth, which is a general rule. That is, the pulp cavity conforms to the general outline of the tooth crown and root. If prominent mamelons, you can see in the figure 1.10b, or have been present, it is not unusual to find definite prolongations or elongations or pulp horns in the incisal regions of the teeth. You can see this in figure 13.8b, 5 and 6. That means if the mamelons are present, you can usually find the pulp horns. You can see this in figure 13.8b, right, 5 and 6. You can see in the figure 5 and 6, you will see the mamelons and the corresponding pulp horns in 5 and 6, right? The pulp cavity then tapers rather evenly along its entire length until reaching the apical constriction. The position of the apical foramen is usually slightly off center from the tip of the root, but some foramina deviate drastically from the apex of the root. The position of the apical foramen is usually slight off center from the tip of the root, but some foramina deviate drastically from the apex of the root. You can see this in figure 13.8b6, right? b6, you can see the apical foramina is not at the center, that is at the tip of the root, but it is deviated from the tip of the root, not in the center. It is present somewhat laterally. Let's have a discussion on the cervical and midroot cross sections. You can see this in figures 13.8 C and D respectively. In figure C, you can see 1 through 6 cervical cross section of root. In D, you can see 1 through 6 the mid root cross sections, right? Let's have a discussion on this. The pulp cavity is widest at about the cervical level, and the pulp chamber is generally centered within the dentin of the root. The pulp cavity is widest at about the cervical level, and the pulp chamber is generally centered within the dentin of the root. You can see this in figure 13.8 C 1 through 5, right? 1 through 5. In this figure 1 through 5. In young individuals, the pulp chamber is roughly triangular in outline, with the pulp chamber is roughly with the base of the triangle at the labial aspect of the root. You can see this in figure 13.8 C5, right? The pulp chamber is triangular in shape with the base at the labial aspect. As the amount of secondary or reactive dentin increases, the pulp chamber becomes more round or crescent shaped. You can see this in figure 13.8 C 3, 4 and 6, right? You can see in the figure 13.8 C 3, 4 and 6. In 3 it is crescent shaped, in 4 it is somewhat crescent shaped, whereas in 6 it is round shaped due to the secondary or reactive dentin formation. The outline form of the root at the cervical level is typically triangular with rounded corners. You can see this in figure 13.8 C5 and 6. C5 and 6, you can see this. It is triangular with rounded corners, but some are more rectangular or angular with rounded corners. You can see this in figure 13.8 C1 through 4, right? In 1, in 2 and in 4 they are rectangular with rounded corners, right? Rectangular with rounded corners. The root and pulp canal tends to be rounded at the mid-root level. You can see this in figure 13.8 D 1 through 6. Then at the cervical level, at the mid-root level, the pulp canal or root canal is more rounded, right? More rounded. You can see in D1 through 6, the pulp canal is almost rounded, right? The anatomy at the mid-root level is essentially the same as that found at the cervical level, just smaller in all dimensions. The anatomy at the mid-root level is essentially the same as that found at the cervical level, just smaller in all dimensions. That's all. Let's have a discussion on the maxillary lateral incisor pulp cavities, right? The maxillary lateral incisor, you can see let's have a discussion on the labiolingual sections. The anatomy of the lateral incisor is similar to that of the central incisor. The pulp cavity of the lateral incisor generally follows the outline form of the crown and the root. The pulp horns are usually prominent. The pulp horns are usually prominent. The pulp chamber is narrow in the incisal region and may become very wide at the cervical level of the tooth. You can appreciate this in figures 13.9 A 1, 2, 3 and 5. Right? Those teeth lacking this cervical enlargement of the pulp chamber possess a root canal that tapers slightly to the apical constriction. You can see this in figure 13.9 A 4 and 6. Right? In these figures 13.9 A 4 and 6 you can see the pulp chamber. You can see the lacking, the pulp chamber is lacking the cervical enlargement, right, and possess a root canal that tapers slightly to the apical constriction and possess a root canal that tapers slightly to the apical constriction. Many of the apical foramina appear to be located at the tip of the root in the labiolingual aspect. Many of the apical foramina appear to be located on the tip of the root in the labiolingual aspect. You can see this in figure 13.9 A 1, 4 and 6. Right? Figure 1, 4 and 6. The apical foramina is located at the tip of the root, whereas some exit on the labial. You can see this in figure 13.9 A2 and 3. The apical foramina exist on the labial aspect, whereas some exist on lingual aspect of the root tip. You can see this in figure 13.9 A5. The apical foramen exist on the lingual aspect. Note, the labiolingual sections does not appear in radiographs. Let's have a discussion on the mesiodistal mesiodistal section. You can see this in figure 13.9 B. The pulp cavity closely follows the external outline of the tooth. The pulp projections or pulp horns appear to be blunted when viewed from the labial aspect of the tooth. This is the you can see this the pulp chamber generally follows the outline form of the root, but secondary dentin may narrow the canal significantly. You can see this in figure 13.9 d 4 and 6. The pulp canal is narrowed due to the formation of secondary dentin. Let's have a discussion on the maxillary canine labiolingual section. In the labiolingual section, from figure 13.10 A and D, right? 13.10 A and D will show the labiolingual section of maxillary canine. This is the figure 13.10 of the maxillary canine. In picture A showing the labiolingual section exposing the mesial or distal aspect of the pulp cavity This aspect does not appear on the dental radiographs. Which aspect? Labiolingual section does not appear on the dental radiographs. Right. We know that the maxillary canine has the largest labiolingual root dimension of any tooth in the mouth. Because the pulp cavity corresponds closely to the outline of the tooth. The size of the pulp chamber of this tooth may also be the largest in the mouth. Because the pulp cavity corresponds closely to the outline of the tooth, the size of the pulp chamber of this tooth may also be the largest in the mouth. The incisal aspect of the canine corresponds to the shape of the crown. The incisal aspect of the canine corresponds to the shape of the crown. If a prominent cusp is present, a long, narrow projection from the pulp chamber, that is pulp horn, will be present. The pulp chamber and incisal third or half of the root canal may be very wide, showing a very abrupt constriction of the root canal in the apical region, which then gently tapers toward the apex. You can see this in figure 13.10 A 4, 5, 6 and 8. Figure A4, 5, 6, 5, 6 and 8. What shows? The pulp chamber. What it shows? The pulp chamber and incisal third or half of the root canal may be very wide. The pulp chamber and incisal third or half of the root canal may be very wide, showing a very abrupt constriction of the root canal in the apical region. You can see in the figure 13.10 A 4, 5 and 6 and 8 and D 16 and 17 and 18. The pulp chamber and incisal third or half of the root canal may be very wide, showing a very abrupt constriction of the root canal in the apical region, which then gently tapers towards the apex. Right. In figure 13.10 A9 D 10, 11, 13 and 14, you can see a root canal may taper evenly from the pulp chamber to the apex of the root. In figure 13.10 A3 and 7, you can see the canines having severe curves in the apical aspect of the root. In figures 13.10 A2 and 5 through 8, D11, 17 and 18, you can see the apical foramen appear to exit at the tip of the root, right? You can see in the figure 13.10 A1, 3 and 4, the apical foramen is labial to the apex of the root. Now let's have a discussion over the mesodistal section. In figure 13.10 B and E, right? In the picture B, you can see the mesodistal section exposing the labial or lingual aspect of the pulp cavity. In E, what you see in E, it is also the mesodistal section exposing the labial or lingual aspect of the pulp cavity, right? We know that the pulp cavity is much narrower in the mesodistal aspect. We know that the pulp cavity is narrower in this maxillary canine. The pulp cavity is much narrower in the mesodistal aspect of the The dimension and degree of taper of the pulp canal of the maxillary canine are very similar to those of the central and lateral incisors. However, the cuspid has a much longer root. The pulp cavity gently tapers from the incisal aspect to the apical foramen. The pulp cavity gently tapers from the incisal aspect to the apical foramen. You can see in the figures 13.10 B1, 4, 6 and 8, E14, 17 and 18. A mesial or distal curve of the apical root may be present. In the figure 13.10 B1, 3 through 5, 7 and 9, E10, 11, 13, 14, 17 and 18, you can see the apical foramen may appear to exit at the tip of the root. This is the figure. You can see in the figure 13.10 B1, 3 through 5, 7 and 9, E10, 11, 13, 14, 17, 18. You can see the apical foramen may appear to exit at the tip of the root. In the figure 13.10 B2, 6 and 8, E12, 15 and 16, you can see the apical foramen exit slightly to the mesial or distal aspect of the root. Let's have a discussion over the cervical cross section. You can see in the figure 13.10c. Here we have not discussed about mid-root cross section. We are discussing about only cervical cross section. In a cervical cross section, the shape of the root and pulp cavity is oval. You can see this in figure 13.10. C 6, 7 and 9. The shape of the pulp cavity is oval, right? It is triangular. You can see this in figure 13.10. C8, right? C8. You can see it is triangular in shape, or it is elliptical. You can see this in figure 13.10. C1 through 5, it is elliptical, right? In figure 1 through in C1 through 5, it is elliptical. In 6, 7 and 9, it is oval. And the pulp chamber and canal are often centered within the crown and the root. You can see this in figure 13.10. C 1, 3, 4 and 9. In this you can appreciate clearly in 1, 3, 4 and 9. The pulp chamber and canal are often centered within the crown and the root.